Welcome back to another learning series with Mr. Knight. Have you ever looked at a family and you notice that one child that looks like no one else, neither looking like the siblings or the parents? You may be wondering. However, if you go far back enough, you may see that trait within a further generation, such as the grandparents or great grandparents. Now, today we're going to make this be clear. So, today we're going to look at genetics or heredity, specifically looking at monohybrid crossing, meaning we're only going to look at one trait at a time. Now, to determine these traits or characteristics that pass from generation to generation, we first must understand what are genes. Well, not this type of genes, but genes that if you zoom into chromosomes, you may find DNA. And if you zoom further in the strands of those DNA, you may find genes. So the genes that we're talking about today, they are segments of DNA that carry coded information or instructions for our individual characteristics or trait. Genes are responsible for transmitting these traits from parents to offspring. So genes are very important in this transmission of traits. Actually, genes themselves don't determine traits, but they are responsible to transmit the traits. Now, importantly to note, some terms before we get into the details. One of the terms is allele. So alleles, they are variant form of genes because genes may exist in different forms. And alleles can be dominant or recessive. Very important for you to note that alleles are written using single letters. If the allele is dominant, you use an uppercase letter, and if the allele is recessive, you use a lowercase letter. Let's take, for example, if red is dominant over white. Notice we look at the same type of trait, color. So the trait here is color, so we use the same letters. However, in the dominant case, we use an uppercase letter, example R for red, and we use a lowercase r for white. We do not use R and W. We must use the same letters because we are dealing with the same trait. Another term for us to note is the genotype. Now, genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism that determines the possibilities of its phenotype. And some examples of genotype, and you need to know these, and a very easy way to remember it is that genotypes are a combination of alleles. So once you combine the alleles, you get your genotype. So remember the example you use of using uppercase R and lowercase r. Then what are the possible ways? What are the possible ways that we can combine these letters? We can put two uppercase R's together, and that is called homozygous dominant because uppercase R is dominant. And homo means same, so they are the two same letters. Or we can have an uppercase and a lowercase. And in this case, it will be heterozygous dominant. Why heterozygous? They are different. So when you see hetero, it means that they are what? Different, upper and lower. And why dominant? Because the dominant trait will always show itself. And then we can have two lowercase r's, and this case now we call them homozygous recessive. Why homo again? Because they are the same, and recessive because they are lowercase. Now the phenotype. Now phenotype is what we describe as the observable traits or features of an organism. So those characteristics that you can notice and observe about something or someone or an organism, then those are what they call a phenotype. And so we can talk about the height, we can talk about the texture of hair, the size of the eyes, the color of the eyes, the shape of the face, the complexion, anything that you can observe, even male and female, are also phenotypic traits. And so once you can observe them, they are known as phenotype. Now, let's put it together. Now, your alleles that we use in the example, let's say red is dominant, so we use an uppercase R to represent red. And let's say white is recessive to red, we use a lowercase r. The possible genotype from these alleles will be two uppercase r's, homozygous dominant, and we can have uppercase, lowercase together, that is heterozygous dominant, or two lowercase, which would be homozygous recessive. Once you have the uppercase letter presenting or present in that genotype, it will show that trait. So in this case, red will be shown as the phenotype for two uppercase r's. An uppercase r and a lowercase r will still show you red because red is dominant over white. So the white will not get a chance to show. However, if you have two lowercase r's, then that time you will see white, because recessive trait can only show itself in the homozygous recessive form. So only when the recessiveness are together, you can see them in the phenotype. Now, to solve genetic problems, we're going to use something called the Punnett square. So Punnett square is simply as a box or a table with 4 parts to show you the resulting possibilities of offspring when you put parents together to mate. Now, a thing to use or an outline to use to assist you in answering these questions is to follow these simple steps. Now, first you determine your allele, then you determine the parental genotype. Notice the genotype of the parents, and then you determine the gametes or the possible gametes that you can get from those parents. And then from your gametes, you do your crossing, because once gametes put together, they will fuse and form fetus or form offspring. And then when you do your cross, you study your cross and look for the possibilities or the probabilities within the offspring. All right, so let's get into it. Let's say you're in an examination and you see this question. The question reads, in flower, red petals are dominant over white petals. A heterozygous flower was crossed with a white flower. Notice this statement did not give a lot of information about the flower. It does say that one is heterozygous and the other is white. Now they may ask you to cross these two flowers and determine the possibilities in the offspring. So let's look at it. If red is dominant, notice said red petals are dominant over white. So if we know red is dominant, then it must represent with an uppercase letter. So since we're going to look at red, let's use R. So we can say that uppercase R represents red. And so if white is recessive, we must use a lowercase letter. And what letter we're going to use? Still R. So we're dealing with the same trait, which is the color of the petals. All right, let's go into it now by the detailed steps. The first thing we're determining is our allele. So the first one, not red, represented by the dominant trait, so it's uppercase R. And white is a recessive trait, so that is represented with a lowercase r. The genotype is how we combine these. But remember in the question it states that one flower is heterozygous. So the heterozygous flower must has an uppercase R and a lowercase r. Hetero means different. The other flower was white. So how that white flower will look? Can that white flower has an uppercase R? Absolutely not. Because once there's an uppercase R, it means that that flower will be red. So the white flower has to be two lowercase r's. Now the gametes. To form gametes, do you remember meiosis? Meiosis, you split cells and you form gametes. So when you split these genotype, what you get as a result are possible gametes. So if we split this heterozygous, what are the possible things that we may get? Uppercase R or lowercase r. So the possible gametes that can come from an heterozygous organism has to be uppercase and a lowercase. What are the possibilities from the white? Only lowercase r's. So the gametes can only contain lowercase r's, not two letters together, because we're looking at only one trait. So let's do a crossing. One flower is heterozygous, so we could put that on top. It could also go to the side. Doesn't matter where you put it, the result will be the same. So one flower was heterozygous, which is uppercase and lowercase. Another flower was white, which is two lowercase r's. And so to get our result within our Punnett square or a box, we go by column and rows, or rows by column. Now in this segment, you'll notice the column here is uppercase R and the row will be lowercase r. So that will be upper and lowercase r. This segment right here, if you notice column and the row, there are two lowercase r's, so that one will be two lowercase r's. In this segment right here, the column is uppercase and the row is lowercase, so that means upper and lower. In this segment, the column is lowercase r and the row is lowercase r, so therefore two lowercase r's. So that will be now our genotype for our possible offspring. So these now represent the result in our first generation. We call this first generation. So you might see F1, which means our first generation or filial generation. So once you establish the genotype of the offspring, you can go ahead and look at your possibilities. Let's look at the possibilities of genotype first. Now the genotypes within the offspring will be heterozygous and homozygous recessive. Now we have 2 out of the 4 being heterozygous, which make it 50% heterozygous dominant. And we also have 2 out of the 4 being homozygous recessive, which means 50% homozygous recessive. It turns out to be a ratio of 1:1 or 2:2. Now let's look at our possibilities within our phenotype. And remember, phenotype is the physical traits or the observable characteristics. So this box right here, since you have an uppercase R, it has to be red. You also have an uppercase R, it has to be red. There's no uppercase R's here, so these have to be white. So it turns out to be that I have 50% will be red and 50% be white, or a ratio of 1:1. If the parents' genotype were different, then you also may get different results. Alright, but for this one, both genotype and phenotype are the same. But do not expect them to be all the same in all questions. Put the genotype of the parents first, and then you look at your results. Now let's go back to something. Remember this situation with this child being here, and people may be questioning and wondering how comes these two parents could have children and this odd one that looks different from everybody else. Let's say they didn't know the family background, but we could determine something. So let's take, for example, that brown in hair color, all right, is recessive, and black in hair color is dominant. So black is dominant over brown. So once we establish that, we could establish the genotype of these individuals. The one that is easiest to determine first is always the one with the 2 recessive alleles. So who can have 2 recessive alleles here? Must be brown, because remember, once you have an uppercase letter, it will show that dominant trait. So for these 2 individuals to be brown, they must have 2 lowercase alleles in the genotype. So we're sure about those 2. We establish those 2 first. Now, for 2 black to have a brown hair child, it therefore means both of them must have at least one of the lowercase b's. So one lowercase b will come from the mother, one lowercase b will come from the father. So both of them must contain at least a lowercase b. But notice that they are black. Therefore means now that these black hair parents must contain uppercase b's as well. So we can sure about those 2. Say they must be heterozygous. Because the only way they could produce this child, both of them must contain the lowercase b. Now, if you do a Punnett square with these heterozygous parents, you'll notice you get a 3-to-1 ratio. You could do that on your own on a piece of paper, and you'll notice that the results will be like these. So there's a 25% chance of getting a homozygous dominant child and a 50% chance of getting heterozygous children, and only 25% chance of getting a homozygous recessive individual. Now, for this male to have heterozygous from a homozygous recessive mother, it therefore means that this father, which you say the grandfather of this child, must contain at least an uppercase B, at least one. So therefore, since we don't go back further enough, we can only assume that this male can be of two possibilities. The two possibilities are the male right here could be heterozygous, or the male could be homozygous dominant. That's the only way this person could come with this person to give you this heterozygous. Now, look at this, go back over it, study it properly, and apply to different questions in genetics. Now, we're at the end of the lesson. Thank you for being here. Continue for watching, and see you in the next lesson, but do not forget to subscribe.